Richard Over, town planner, urban designer. Obviously, we're not creating a new zoning district in a vacuum or in the abstract. We thoroughly intend to bring forward later a proposed mapping of that district onto land in the town of Summerfield. I want to talk to you about where we are in the process of creating that plan, summarize it for you. This will not be as long as the presentation that I made for the public forum before last. But it'll explain where it applies and why we think that the flexibility Tom and Chris described will be important. I'm going to pause on the OSM district and go through 5 quick points that are the key issues we think are reasons not to process the plan we're working on as OSM, instead do this MPVD. And then David Couch at the end wanted to have a moment to talk with you. The land shown here in white, which is roughly paralleling I-73 on the west, bounded in that triangle by 220 on the east and the city of Greensboro on the south. Just under 1,000 acres. This gives an opportunity to plan a large amount of the town in great detail. And the benefit of doing so is much larger tracts of permanent preserved open space, much more certainty about the long vistas and the detail of the neighborhoods that would be created in among that. Now, we started looking at the land just this winter with Mr. Couch and his team, and walking around, looking at the property, getting to understand it and its neighborhood. We sent our drone up to get lots and lots of pictures from high angles so we could go back and forth between the maps and the place that we know. We didn't start with a number of square feet of commercial development, or a number of parking spaces, or a number of dwelling units, or the exact menu of land uses. And instead, we started with what kind of places should be created, what kind of places should be preserved. The first step in that has been kind of a storyboarding process, similar to the one a filmmaker might use before going out to shoot their film. They picture what could this be, what should that scene be, and those sketches start very loosely. And as we work, they get more precise, and we develop the ideas. And this is a way of testing them with our clients and thinking about what could be. I just want to show you a few of the starter ideas that underlie the work we have so far. Be very clear, we don't have the plan yet. We have lots of drafts and sketches and things. We don't have numbers yet. We will, in plenty of time, to be very precise when we map that NPVD to these lands about the total number of dwelling units to be built or any of the other issues that have been raised. First among the list of starter ideas is the idea of preserving long vistas as described in the comprehensive plan. You'll probably recognize this one as a view from Pleasant Ridge Road looking southwest, or southeast rather, across the Thomas property. And so the Thomas farmhouse is just over the shoulder of the photographer on the left. And that space right there, we saw as not just as a place where somebody could conveniently build, but instead a place where somebody, if they were careful about it, could push the development farther within the property and preserve that long vista in perpetuity. And it's not a little thing, it's a big thing. In that spot where I was standing to take that picture, just on the corner of the Thomas farmhouse barnyard, across that pasture by itself, just that one piece is more than 1,000 feet. And so we studied that, we went back to the maps, we found that tree line, and in this sketch, for example, explored the idea of pushing all the development to the east of that line. So it would all be on the other side of that pasture and the tree line in perpetuity. That kind of idea, so there's that angle that you saw in the photograph before. That kind of idea is one we can do many places in this property. For example, many of y'all visited the interior of Summerfield Farms where the little wedding tree is in the middle of that picture. That's another one of those really long vistas, part of a large set of pastures. So we turned to the map and we said, what if that space, there's the arrow you just saw, was part of an even more vast open space preserve? To get the preserves to be that large, you can't plan 50 or 100 acres at a time. You need to plan a much larger area. And in every sense of the word, economic, environmental, quality of life, and rural conservation, bigger open spaces conserved are better than smaller ones. This is one of those things where size matters, and only possible by bringing a lot of the canvas, a lot of the map, under scrutiny at the same time, which is why multiple parcels can be combined in an MPVD application. Now, in the middle of this picture is the Thomas farmhouse, and running along the back behind it, you see the Pleasant Ridge Road. So this is on the east side of the area where the Summerfield Farms Village barn is. And we say, well, what if that area, where there's another one of those tree lines, could be preserved as the organic garden, and then the farm-to-table restaurant, the concept that could be a potential reuse for the Thomas farmhouse, became a place where you could, in the neighborhood, enjoy a meal and also see where the food was grown, but not see a bunch of development, because the development is pushed into the interior of the Thomas parcel. So those are illustrations of that idea. By the way, that kind of access, easy walking from the neighborhood, prohibited in the OSM ordinance. It says, thou shalt not go to anything commercial, accessing it through anything residential. So I think what you're getting at from these pictures of the open space is that the green parts come first in this kind of planning. That means the preserves, the things that remain in agriculture, the public squares, and the green tree-lined streets. And so here's an illustration of the idea of residential development overlooking one of those green tree-lined streets and beyond at a large-scale preserve. In a picture like this, you can imagine the owner of that house getting a big public benefit, probably a big benefit to them from overlooking that space, but there's also a public benefit in keeping the public spaces accessible to the public. So we illustrated the fronts of buildings, not the backs, not the barbecue grills and the private decks, the fronts of buildings overlooking the open space. Those are the kinds of things that inform the map. Now, in a picture like that, you can't tell from a glance whether that's one big house, which it could be. Obviously, the house that inspired it was one big house, but that could also be 3 row houses. Or that could be 5 apartments or multifamily units in a mansion. So it really, in an image like this, you kind of get the idea that the number of units is not how you determine what the quality of the place will be. But you can get the idea that it's possible to get your open space and also introduce more variety in housing choices into the town of Summerfield. So what do I mean by variety of housing choices? Well, the OSM ordinance contemplates clustering. For example, it means moving the buildings closer together so that you can keep more open space open. But that could lead to creative alternatives like cottage courts and so-called pocket neighborhoods. On the bottom left is a 600-year-old idea for courtyard senior housing. And yes, multifamily buildings in proud, worthy, multifamily buildings that belong in a beautiful neighborhood in a beautiful town. And so all of those are part of housing choices that we think MPVD could make possible. Now I want to just pause here for a second and ask you to compare a couple of pictures to get why I'm saying the numbers don't come first. You just compare this picture to this picture. What you're going to discover is that they're exactly the same. The same land use, the same density, the same lot size, the same parking quantities, the same house size. They are the same in all the crude tools of planning by the numbers. The difference between these is the design, the building to street relationships, the building to public space relationships, the architectural detail. Those are all things that can be specified in those documents that come with an approved MPVD zoning. And they have to be found by the town to be agreeable to the town, to be satisfactory to the town, in order for that zoning to land on that part of the map. That's why we think that's the time to do it. When you're looking at the real plan, you know, this, for example, if you want to, there's a neighborhood square, it's illustrated in the required sketch plan. The location of it is known. If you want to have that walkable neighborhood where you could walk to get a cup of coffee and meet a friend within the neighborhood instead of having to drive a long distance on the regional road network at peak hour to do that same thing, if you want to have that, you have to design it that way. And that's why those details come forward at that stage of the rezoning. By the way, the image that you see right here would also be prohibited under OSM, where it doesn't allow the commercial and residential components to combine. So if you just below that idea, but keep going, over more and more of the property. This is Thomas Summerfield Farms in Armfield. It's undeveloped portions put into one map. You see what we mean by starting with the green parts, by making connected neighborhoods and keeping the green open spaces, forested and pastures, as large as possible and as connected and continuous as possible. And you also see the idea of the tree-lined streets. So in terms of streets, well, the street standards, like a standard for street trees and the other dimensions for slow and safe and walkable streets would be part of what is agreed to in detail at the time of MPVD. So we've already started, because we have to do maps and add this stuff up, thinking about what kinds of space to reserve and what the details of such streets would be. We have at this point a palette of 17 or 18 street types here, or a couple of them, including one with a trail. So, trails, another big starter idea is that development here makes possible the connected of significant planned but unbuilt regional trail systems. Two of them, one north-south, one east-west, and hooking that in to the trail and walkway system within the development itself. No gates, an open, connected community. We've also spent some time thinking about the architecture, and architectural standards would be part of what's submitted as part of an MPVD. So that would include details of all the components of a building, materials, proportions, architectural styles, these kinds of things. We don't stop there. We also specify in great detail, much more detail than the regular zoning, all those building to street relationships, the building to building relationships, the distances between things, to preserve privacy and quality as the development is done over time. So I call these the quality control tools because when you put them together, the street design standards, the lot and building standards, landscape standards, and architecture, you get a higher demand on the future developers than that which would come from the conventional zoning. And that's what it says in MPVD, that it has to achieve a higher standard in order to be worthy in the town's judgment before that map gets marked with that zone. Now, just to finish here, to say what's the difference between the zone you just worked on, the OSM zoning within your Unified Development Ordinance, and the one we're proposing. The big differences are, what we're proposing is a system under which you can get much more specific and much more predictable about what is allowed and what is not. We'll also make the large-scale zoning, large-scale open space feasible and allow more housing types, yes, including multifamily. So how did we come to that conclusion? We went through the ordinance line by line, and there were a number of things we studied. This will all be posted on the website if you want to go read the individual points that we took issue with, but I will summarize them for you. There's a list, for example, of what's permitted. There's restrictions on the amount of commercial, as Chris mentioned. Here's the summary. First, if you want to have housing variety and clustering, much more refinement of the ordinance is needed. To use OSM would be missing out on a lot of the opportunity. Second, the numbers are too low. It's not going to be feasible to get all of those great public benefits if you only have such a small yield. Third, you can't say, I want the lots to be huge and I want the open space to be huge. You have to be willing to accept right sizing of lots in order to get those big open spaces. Fourth, it didn't list multifamily housing on the list of permitted uses, and that will be necessary in order to achieve the first goal in the first sentence of the description of the zone in OSM, which is to get some moderately priced housing. And then last, the access and quantities of the non-residential components need to be reconciled with what we have.